Hello and welcome to Close Reading Classic Literature with me, Dr. Octavia Cox. Today I'm going to be looking at Jane Austen's magnificent novel Mansfield Park, and in particular I'm going to be looking at Lady Bertram's letters to Fanny Price when Fanny Price is suffering in Portsmouth. So I'm going to look at Lady Bertram's epistolary style, so her letter writing style. An epistle is a letter. And what this reveals about her selfishness, her emotional detachment, and her intellectual dullness. So I'm going to talk about Lady Bertram also in relation to the 19th century kind of polite habit of commonplacing. So this is going to be a fun video because the passage that I'm going to be analysing is essentially Jane Austen mocking bad letter writing and bad letter writers. A central part of close reading and literary analysis is understanding how a text's form informs its meaning. In other words, how the construction of a text, the way that it is formed, adds to the reader's understanding of that text's meaning. And this is an excellent example, I think, that I'm going to be looking at today. Readers can see this very particularly by comparing two of Lady Bertram's letters about Tom's illness towards the end of Mansfield Park. So in the two letters, the content is virtually identical. That is, Tom is very ill and Lady Bertram is very worried about him. But the way in which Jane Austen chooses to form these two letters of Lady Bertram's exposes something much deeper about Lady Bertram's character. So although the content is ostensibly the same, the way in which it's conveyed actually provides the reader with a great deal of kind of additional other meaning. So let me turn to the chapter in question from Mansfield Park. This is volume 3, chapter 13, if your edition is using the original designation, or it's chapter 44 in consecutively numbered editions. So to put everything in context, Fanny Price has been banished to the Price family home in Portsmouth. So she is removed from the main action happening in London and at Mansfield. And Fanny Price is receiving news via letters from the other principal characters. One letter that Fanny receives is from Edmund Bertram, in which he laments not being able to stop loving Mary Crawford, which is of course a knife in Fanny Price's heart. But for our purposes today, the relevant point is that Edmund ends the letter thus: "It is quite settled that the Grants go to Bath. They leave Mansfield on Monday. I am glad of it. I am not comfortable enough to be fit for anybody, but your aunt, Lady Bertram, seems to feel out of luck that such an article of Mansfield news should fall to my pen instead of hers. Yours ever, my dearest Fanny." If Edmund knew that his mother wanted to communicate such an article of Mansfield news, of the Grants leaving Mansfield, to Fanny herself, perhaps he could have left it to her pen instead of his own. Is this another example of Edmund Bertram's quiet, passive selfishness? Well, that's a side point and not what I want to focus on today. But what Edmund Bertram does reveal here is relevant to Lady Bertram's epistolary style because it introduces her epistolary style, her letter writing style, which is to turn local news, an article of Mansfield news, into fodder for occupying her idle hours. Lady Bertram has barely engaged with the Grants at all in the course of the novel so far, and yet news of their leaving would have provided her with hours of occupation. Jane Austen, in her representation of Lady Bertram's epistolary style, exposes the vacuity of such detached disengagement of real emotion. So Lady Bertram does not actually care that the Grants are leaving Mansfield, but she cares that in their leaving she has lost a use for them as a vehicle through which to communicate herself. As I analyse the text specifically relating to Lady Bertram's epistolary style, which I will get onto in a minute, I will focus on two aspects in particular. So first, what Jane Austen criticises in her representation of Lady Bertram's epistolary style, and by extension, of course, many women like Lady Bertram, as the text itself points out, is the selfishness of those who enjoy trading in news, especially in bad news, as a way merely to occupy themselves, detached of any real emotion. Second, what Jane Austen also exposes in this section that I'm about to unpick is the conventional, almost formal language of affectedness. So in Lady Bertram's first letter to Fanny, particularly, this is the language of affectedness, contrasted with the, quote, language of real feeling, as the narrative voice calls it, in Lady Bertram's second letter. So there's a comparison of the language of affectedness and the language of real feeling. Preferring the language of real feeling aligns Jane Austen's narrative voice in Mansfield Park with her fellow literary contemporaries, the Romantics. In his preface to the Lyrical Ballads from 1800, for instance, William Wordsworth, one of the preeminent Romantic period poets, had argued that good writing expresses powerful feelings using the real language of men in a state of vivid sensation. That's a key kind of tenet of Romanticism, is this idea of good art and good poetry in William Wordsworth's case, but good art generally, in fact, using the real language of feeling. The idea of verisimilitude, so life-likeness, becoming important to art, to writing, to literature. To get to the text of Mansfield Park itself, everybody at all addicted to letter writing, without having much to say, which will include a large proportion of the female world at least. Is this a dig at the lack of proper education of women like Lady Bertram, who have nothing to say, nothing of special value or concern or interest to communicate to the rest of the world? Well, yes, I think so. But the coy "at least" also suggests that writing without having much to say will also apply to plenty of men too. Must feel with Lady Bertram that she was out of luck in having such a capital piece of Mansfield news as the certainty of the Grants going to Bath occur at a time when she could make no advantage of it. So news is something for people like Lady Bertram to be made advantage of. She does not actually care that the Grants are leaving at all, but she is vexed that she is deprived of the final use she can make of them, and will admit that it must have been very mortifying to her to see it fall to the share of her thankless son, that is Edmund, so he was the one who wrote about it, and treated as concisely as possible at the end of a long letter, instead of having it to spread over the largest part of a page of her own. So unlike Edmund, Lady Bertram would be thankful to be able to communicate the news. For Lady Bertram, news then is not merely information to be conveyed as concisely as possible, the bald facts, you might say, but a way to occupy herself, as she seems to have no other more useful employment. What this reveals to us, perhaps, about Lady Bertram is that she doesn't think at all about the letter receiver. She doesn't think, well, actually, does Fanny really want a whole page of my musings on the Grants leaving to go to Bath, particularly, if it can be conveyed kind of concisely as Edmund has done it. But Lady Bertram doesn't think at all about the letter recipient. She doesn't think about what Fanny might want. She thinks about what use she can make of the Grant's leaving and the kind of occupation this will provide her with. Or rather, that it would have provided her with if her thankless son hadn't kind of stolen it away from her. For though Lady Bertram rather shone in the epistolary line, having early in her marriage from the want of other employment, and one might have thought that superintending the education of her 4 children, especially the education of her 2 daughters, as the novel sort of proves later on, one might have thought that superintending the education of her children might have provided occupation for her. But no, she's taken up letter writing to kind of occupy her time. So from the want of other employment and the circumstance of Sir Thomas's being in Parliament, meaning that Sir Thomas is frequently away in London in Parliament, and so he is not occupying her time either. So because of this, Lady Bertram had got into the way of making and keeping correspondence and formed for herself a very creditable, commonplace, amplifying style, so that a very little matter was enough for her. So, a very creditable, commonplace, amplifying style. What does this really mean? The Oxford English Dictionary defines creditable as respectable, decent, reputable, presentable. Now passing into sense 3, commendable, but not necessarily outstanding or successful. In calling Lady Bertram's style very creditable, the narrative voice is essentially damning her with faint praise. Lady Bertram writes moral platitudes averagely well. There is a sort of pun also on the word commonplace here. So on the one hand, commonplace means sort of ordinary, but it also relates to an 18th century activity of commonplacing. So commonplacing was recording a saying or a moral or a quotation or an aphorism, some kind of nugget of interest that you wanted to record. So you'd record that in a notebook called your commonplace book. So commonplace books were repositories of useful, apparently, although not always, of course, depending on what you chose to put in them, repositories of information. So often these were divided into sections. So you might have a section on money and another section on love and another section on virtue and another section on learning. Or you might have something a bit more practical, such as useful mothering advice or useful gardening tips or whatever. And as an aside, you can see why the dominant literary, certainly dominant poetic form in the 18th century was the heroic couplet, which is epigrammatic in style. And it goes hand in hand with the 18th century fashion for commonplacing, because these couplet long mottos are very convenient to extract. And a very common example, so if you had a section on learning in your commonplace book, a very common example was Alexander Pope's lines, his kind of aphoristic motto from an essay on criticism from 1711, which you might still hear occasionally today. A little learning is a dangerous thing. Drink deep or taste not the Pierian spring. So in Greek mythology, the Pierian spring is the spring sacred to the Muses on Mount Olympus. So returning then to Lady Bertram's epistolary style in Mansfield Park. Here, amplify means, and again this is the Oxford English Dictionary, to enlarge a story or statement by telling it more diffusely or fully, or by adding fresh details, illustrations or reflections, to expand, to make much of. So we can interpret the overall description of Lady Bertram's very creditable, commonplace, amplifying style then to mean that she offers moral platitudes or conventional pieces of wisdom that she then amplifies, expounds on, makes much of, writes diffusely in a formulaic manner. She could not do entirely without any subject matter. She must have something to write about, even to her niece. So a very little matter was enough for her because Lady Bertram, because she just needed the prompt of the subject matter to figuratively go to her commonplace book and pull out all her platitudes on illness or virtue or learning or whatever it is. And this very creditable commonplace style is reminiscent, I think, of Mr. Bennet's mockery of Mr. Collins's pre-planned platitudinous expressions in Pride and Prejudice, when he facetiously asks, "You judge very properly," said Mr. Bennet, "and it is happy for you that you possess the talent of flattering with delicacy. May I ask whether these pleasing attentions proceed from the impulse of the moment, or are the result of previous study?" And we might ask the same question of Lady Bertram's expressions about Tom's illness in her letters that I'm just about to get onto. Do they proceed from the impulse of the moment, or are they too the result of previous study? Is she, Lady Bertram, kind of drawing out her commonplace pre-planned expressions about illness, and being so soon to lose all the benefit of Dr. Grant's gouty symptoms? There we go. So if you have your poetic extracts or whatever on illness, then you would be able to apply them to Dr. Grant's gouty symptoms and Mrs. Grant's morning calls. It was very hard upon her to be deprived of one of the last epistolary uses she could put them to. This is a revealing line, uses she could put them to, because it exposes Lady Bertram's quiet selfishness. She thinks of others in terms of what uses she can put them to. There was a rich amends, however, preparing for her. Lady Bertram's hour of good luck came. And there's a dark irony here from the narrative voice. Lady Bertram's good luck is to have the rich amends of lots of material to fill her upcoming letters, because she is now about to have something to write about. And Austen, I think, then has great fun showing readers Lady Bertram's very creditable, commonplace, amplifying style in action in the first letter from Lady Bertram about Tom's illness to Fanny Price, now in Portsmouth. The letter is a parody of the epistolary style that was conventional in dull, unthinking people in the Regency period, and it is a style, something which the Romantic period poets were also rebelling against. That is formal, superficial, formulaic, and so stilted as to be virtually without a sense of real feeling. And Jane Austen, like the Romantics, is rebelling against what the Romantics called poetic diction. That is, the language of kind of affectation. Within a few days from the receipt of Edmund's letter, Fanny had one from her aunt beginning thus, and this is the first letter. "My dear Fanny, I take up my pen to communicate some very alarming intelligence, which I make no doubt will give you much concern." This was a great deal better than to have to take up the pen to acquaint her with all the particulars of the Grants' intended journey, for the present intelligence was of a nature to promise occupation for the pen for many days to come, being no less than the dangerous illness of her eldest son, of which they had received notice by express a few hours before. So this was a great deal better than to have to take up the pen to acquaint her, Fanny, with all the particulars of the Grants' intended journey. The narrative voice here implies that Lady Bertram rather enjoys being at the centre of having some alarming intelligence to convey. Tom's illness is a great deal better, as subject matter for letters than the departure of the grants, as the details are more juicy, and it allows Lady Bertram to rehearse an entirely new selection of commonplaces. This distressing intelligence, as you may suppose, observed her ladyship, and notice the diction that Jane Austen has chosen here for the narrative voice and what it implies. Observed her ladyship. When things are really dire, one does not have time for reflection or observation. This distressing intelligence, as you may suppose, observed her ladyship, after giving the substance of it, has agitated us exceedingly, and we cannot prevent ourselves from being greatly alarmed and apprehensive for the poor invalid, whose state Sir Thomas fears may be very critical, and Edmund kindly proposes attending his brother immediately. But I am happy to add that Sir Thomas will not leave me on this distressing occasion, as it would be too trying for me. We shall greatly miss Edmund in our small circle, but I trust and hope he will find the poor invalid in a less alarming state than might be apprehended, and that he will be able to bring him to Mansfield shortly, which Sir Thomas proposes should be done, and thinks best on every account. And I flatter myself the poor sufferer will soon be able to bear the removal without material inconvenience or injury. As I have little doubt of your feeling for us, my dear Fanny, under these distressing circumstances, I will write again very soon. So in this first letter as a whole, there are lots of words of agitation and distress. Indeed, the word distressing is used 3 times in one short letter. It is distressing intelligence, a distressing occasion with distressing circumstances. But the tone rather suggests otherwise. Lady Bertram describes the occasion using diction such as very alarming intelligence, much concern, agitated us exceedingly, greatly alarmed and apprehensive, fears may be very critical, too trying, alarming state. But she also includes unnecessary phrases which suggest that she is not quite as alarmed or distressed as the content of the letter announces. Lady Bertram includes phrases, for example, such as, I take up my pen to communicate, I make, no doubt, will give you much concern, as you may suppose, we cannot prevent ourselves, but I am happy to add that, I flatter myself. These lines are extraneous additions, amplifications, which do not add anything substantive to the letter. They are padding, which undermine any sense of real urgency or fear. If you were really that worried, you would get to the kind of heart of the matter. You wouldn't kind of pad it out with all this unnecessary politeness. We might also observe that Lady Bertram, instead of using her son's name, Tom, refers to the poor invalid twice, and subsequently to the poor sufferer. This is affected, oddly formal, and disengaged language. Instead of Lady Bertram's expression, we cannot prevent ourselves from being greatly alarmed and apprehensive for the poor invalid, it would sound much less contrived if she had written something less conventionally amplified. Compare what Lady Bertram wrote with something instead like, we are greatly alarmed and apprehensive for Tom. Fanny's feelings on the occasion were indeed considerably more warm and genuine than her aunt's style of writing. She felt truly for them all. So this implies, of course, that Lady Bertram's epistolary style is conversely cold and inauthentic, affected, ungenuine. And the text is very clear about being critical of Lady Bertram's style of writing. So Fanny's feelings were considerably more warm and genuine than her aunt's style of writing. So her aunt's style of writing, conversely, is cold and ungenuine. She, Fanny, felt truly for them all. So what does that imply about Lady Bertram? That she does not truly feel for them all. I think that's kind of implied here in the way that this is constructed, the way that Austen has constructed this section. Her aunt did not neglect her. She wrote again and again. They were receiving frequent accounts from Edmund. So Edmund is sending letters about Tom to Sir Thomas and Lady Bertram, and these accounts were as regularly transmitted to Fanny in Portsmouth, in the same diffuse style and the same medley of trusts, hopes and fears, all following and producing each other at haphazard. Lady Bertram's epistolary character, then, is a diffuse style, both in the sense of scattered, but also verbose, long-winded. And in the word haphazard, we are back to the idea of commonplacing. So Lady Bertram's mind is like a commonplace book in that it is merely a collection, a medley of trite bromides. Jane Austen's choice of diction in using the word medley is further revealing too. So here is Samuel Johnson's 18th century definition of medley from his Dictionary of the English Language from 1755. So he describes medley as a mixture, a miscellany, a mingled mass. It is commonly used with some degree of contempt. So the diction then reveals the narrative voice's contempt for Lady Bertram's epistolary style and what that style reveals about what Lady Bertram values. It was a sort of playing at being frightened. The sufferings which Lady Bertram did not see had little power over her fancy, and she wrote very comfortably about agitation and anxiety and poor invalids. It's a beautiful line here. There is a kind of biting satire in Austen's use of antithesis, in the juxtaposition of comfortably and agitation and anxiety. She can write very comfortably about it because she doesn't really feel agitated or anxious, because she cannot actually see Tom ill in front of her. She is not actually upset. And the text tells readers that she does not have the imaginative capacity to perceive or feel suffering at a distance. And the narrative voice picks up too on Lady Bertram referring to the poor invalid rather than using her own son's name. And by pluralising it, so she wrote very comfortably about poor invalids, the narrative voice further depersonalises Lady Bertram's observations. Lady Bertram writes of generalised poor invalids rather than Tom specifically. She is commonplacing rather than actually feeling. And while Tom is away and she is not actually confronted face to face with his illness is merely a vehicle through which Lady Bertram can repeat her comfortable, polite, conventional phrases about her trusts, hopes, fears, etc. that such people always trot out when anybody is ill. Lady Bertram wrote very comfortably about agitation and anxiety and poor invalids till Tom was actually conveyed to Mansfield, and with her own eyes had beheld his altered appearance. Then a letter which she had been previously preparing for Fanny was finished in a different style, in the language of real feeling and alarm. Then she wrote as she might have spoken. She wrote as she might have spoken. The narrative voice sees this as an endorsement of the second upcoming letter. And this ties in with what I was talking about in a recent previous lecture on phonocentrism in Jane Austen's writing, especially in Captain Wentworth's letter to Anne Elliot at the end of Persuasion. And I won't go into detail as I defined and explained the term in that video. And at the end of this video, do go back and watch that one if you're interested. But to outline phonocentrism, Phonocentrism is a philosophical linguistic term meaning the tendency to value speech above writing in linguistic analysis, especially the view that spoken language is the immediate realization of meaning. In other words, phonocentrism is the tendency to regard the spoken word as primary, organic, authentic, because less mediated by the constructions and conventions of language, and so closer to kind of real, genuine meaning. And the written word as secondary because it is apparently more consciously constructed, so more artificial and therefore at a remove from meaning. In the construction here in Mansfield Park of Lady Bertram's letters, the narrative voice champions phonocentrism and phonocentric language. Lady Bertram wrote in the second letter, we are told, in the language of real feeling and alarm when she wrote as she might have spoken. The implication being that before, as evidenced in the first letter, she had written affectedly and artificially. So she only writes real feelings when she writes as she might have spoken. This is the second letter. He has just come, my dear Fanny, and is taken upstairs, and I am so shocked to see him that I do not know what to do. I am sure he has been very ill. Poor Tom! I am quite grieved for him, and very much frightened, and so is Sir Thomas, and how glad I should be if you were here to comfort me. But Sir Thomas hopes that he will be better tomorrow, and says we must consider his journey. The real solicitude, so care, concern, now awakened in the maternal bosom, was not soon over. This second letter, unlike the first one, comprises short, direct clauses without padding. Before, she had written that Tom's illness has agitated us exceedingly, and we cannot prevent ourselves from being greatly alarmed and apprehensive. But now she writes directly, I am very much frightened, and so is Sir Thomas. And rather than the generic label, the poor invalid, he is now specifically poor Tom. And we note that this is a whole sentence, a single exclamation. She is writing down the thoughts as they cross her mind, rather than her usual letter writing practice of filtering observations through her polite, amplifying, commonplacing process. And very cleverly, Jane Austen constructs Lady Bertram's two letters to be structurally identical. Lady Bertram, first having addressed my dear Fanny. She starts the main body of the letter in both by discussing so hers and Sir Thomas's, agitation and shock, their fears and fright. She then moves on in both to discuss what she wants for herself, and she then describes what Sir Thomas proposes and thinks best, hopes and says. And by putting them side by side, we can see how much more direct and to the point her second letter is. Lady Bertram's use of the language of real feeling in her second letter reflects the real solicitude now awakened in her. So Jane Austen has that word real repeated twice at these kind of crucial moments. And this serves through counterpoint to expose the artificiality of her previous epistolary style. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Remember, if you like what I do here on my channel where I analyse classic literature, then do subscribe. And if you have liked the video, then do please press the like button. It helps me out in YouTube's algorithm. And what do you think we can take from Lady Bertram's epistolary style? Do leave your thoughts in the comments below.